customer satisfaction training series. Last week, we covered some big picture topics around customer satisfaction. We discussed overall principles of customer satisfaction, discussed some activities that you can do back at your agency, like developing standards for customer service, developing a customer service mission statement, and also talk through the importance of creating an overall culture within your agency that emphasizes quality improvement and customer satisfaction. And so we are picking up where the previous webinar left off. So our agenda for this afternoon will be, first of all, talking about how you design the structure that supports your overall customer satisfaction and quality improvement system. So what does that look like in terms of creating a committee or assigning a staff person? What are the responsibilities for working on quality improvement and customer service issues? And how do you make sure you have a truly integrated system that's collecting data across your programs and services? Secondly, we'll talk about survey design, data collection, and data analysis for customer satisfaction. So we'll talk through the logistics and mechanics of actually distributing your customer satisfaction surveys. We'll provide some examples from other agencies of how they go about this process. We'll talk through the questions that you might ask at different points as you collect that customer satisfaction data, and we'll talk about how to analyze your data to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. So with that said, I wanted to start off again just by listing some key resources. We know that your time is precious, and there are actually a fair number of resources out there on customer satisfaction, since it is a critical business process. However, the literature that you see up on your screen would be my personal choices for the 3 things that you should read if you want some additional discussion on customer satisfaction. So those first 2 publications from the Center of the Study of Social Policy were developed out of a project that CSSP did, looking specifically at customer satisfaction systems in nonprofits and public agencies. The first one reviews the literature on customer satisfaction for those 2 sectors, so I think it's some of the best big picture overview out there on the data, the different articles, and talking in general about customer satisfaction. It's drawn from a study that CSSP did with about 100 different organizations, and many of the specific examples and content of this webinar are taken from the reports that they developed out of that work. The second publication, also from CSSP, goes into more detail about the framework for a customer satisfaction system. So it talks about what that framework would include. It goes into more detail about the nuts and bolts of putting a customer satisfaction system together. And then that last publication from the Urban Institute talks about the issues with actually conducting a survey to collect data from customers specifically on outcomes. So I think taken together, it's a combination of big picture overview, practical nuts and bolts about the design of your system, and details for making sure your surveys are getting you the information that you need. All of these resources are available for free on the internet. Just type in the title of the particular publication and you should be able to download a PDF. And the partnership will also hopefully be putting up some of these resources as well, but for now you can just get those off the internet, again, for no cost. So let's begin where we picked up, where we stopped off last week, measuring customer satisfaction, actually collecting and analyzing the data. So first off, I just wanted to talk briefly a little bit about the difference between data, information, and knowledge. And so data is simply facts that are observed, measured, collected, and aggregated. So when you're collecting customer satisfaction data, you're getting those raw numbers of your scores about how you're doing in terms of different factors related to customer satisfaction. The challenge is if you don't turn that data into information by analyzing it, it really doesn't do you that much good. And so we know that there are some programs that require you to collect customer satisfaction data. If you're a public agency, that's probably a process that you already do as part of your overall customer satisfaction system. But of course, unless you analyze that data, turn it into useful information, it's not ultimately going to be that helpful. And then finally, knowledge is created once you've collected your data, turned it into information by analyzing it, and then compared that information in your system overall over a period of time. So looking at what factors improve or decrease customer satisfaction, learning more about how your programs operate, what it takes to create high levels of customer satisfaction. And so knowledge is really what happens to information when you use it in a rigorous way over a longer period of time. And I think that's a very helpful way to underscore the importance of putting together a customer satisfaction system as a whole as part of a broader quality improvement effort. We talked last week about the connection between customer satisfaction and the results-oriented management and accountability framework, and I just wanted to reemphasize that collecting and analyzing customer satisfaction data is part of the overall ROMA cycle. It is literally ROMA in action because you're looking at how you're doing in terms of your customer satisfaction data and then hopefully feeding that back into your program design and implementation to identify ways to improve service delivery, increase your customer satisfaction, and through that, hopefully improve the outcomes for your end users, the customers that your agency serves. So using your customer satisfaction data in a systematic, consistent way is crucially important to make sure that you're engaging in the ROMA cycle and making sure that you're using that data in a process of continuous improvement. And so when we talk about customer satisfaction, I want to stress that ideally it's part of an overall agency commitment to quality improvement that's embodied in that ROMA cycle, the idea that we are continuously looking at how we are doing as community action agencies, identifying places where we're successful and finding ways to build on those strengths and those successes, and looking at where we have opportunities for improvement, so we're continuously improving the ultimate outcomes that our customers are able to get through our programs and services. So with that big picture said, let's talk a little bit more about what your actual quality improvement structure, at least ideally, should look like. And when I talk to our agencies out in the field, when I'm doing training on customer satisfaction, what I usually hear from them is that they're sort of somewhere in the middle in terms of their overall design of a customer satisfaction system. And so what I mean by that is that agencies are probably collecting some data from their programs on customer satisfaction some of the time. Probably a lot of the analysis of that data happens at the program level, but it's a little bit less common for an agency to have a structure like a quality improvement committee or a quality improvement staff person who's specifically tasked for routinely analyzing the data that's collected from programs and services. So what you see on the screen is simply a very simple picture of what a overall quality improvement structure should look like. So one of the things that we discussed a little bit last week, we'll talk about a little bit more later on, is the frequency of data collection. But you see there at the very bottom, your programs and services should ideally be collecting customer satisfaction data on a regular basis. So if you have a program that is in continuous operation, I would think that ideally you're collecting that customer satisfaction data and analyzing it hopefully on a monthly basis. Of course, sometimes we just simply don't have the staff and overall capacity to do that. So a quarterly basis would certainly also be another approach if it is a little bit more difficult to collect that data more frequently. And ideally, your staff at the program level is on a regular basis talking about their customer service results, what the feedback from the customer says, looking for ways to improve the quality of those programs and services, and doing that as part of their regular approach to managing their programs. At that middle level, what you see is the Quality Improvement Committee. And this can also be a single staff person if you're a smaller agency. But for me, the most important point to make here is that you need someplace, a structure or a person to channel all the information that's being collected at that program level. You need ideally a couple of folks, and we'll talk about who those might be in the next slide, who are routinely looking at that customer satisfaction data from across the agency. So in the same way your CFO looks at your overall budget numbers from your agency on a regular basis, the Quality Improvement Committee would be looking at the results that are coming back from your different offices, from your different programs, and taking the time to look at the big picture of how your agency is doing in terms of quality improvement, making sure that staff are discussing both their strengths and opportunities for improvement, and also looking at overall ways to improve programs and services. And then, of course, at the top is the leadership team, and so your Quality Improvement Committee or your staff person, again, if you're a smaller agency, it just might be one person in that role, should be routinely reporting that data on up to the leadership team level. So your Quality Improvement Committee might meet on a monthly basis. They might meet on a quarterly basis to look at data collected from across your agency. And then they should certainly report, I would suggest, no less frequently than quarterly to your leadership team, talk about the overall trends that they see, and make sure that the leadership team stays up to date on what the numbers are saying. But for me, one thing you can reflect on at your agency is what the structure and process currently looks like at your agency in terms of collecting that customer satisfaction data. So if there is no committee or single staff person to report that data to, I think an important next step would be to figure out how to set up at least the basics of a structure for making sure there's a place to report that data to, and a regular process and protocols in place, hopefully written down in a policy, so you have a truly formal management system for collecting data and managing overall quality improvement efforts across your agency. So next, the Quality Improvement Committee membership, I think, could potentially include several types of staff. I would suggest that you would want someone, at least a couple of folks from frontline staff, maybe a permanent representative who could speak directly to sort of the day-to-day work that staff do. And then you might have a rotating representative from different programs. Get a different staff person in for your meetings, just to make sure that you keep your ear to the ground and are learning about what's going on in different programs in terms of customer satisfaction and other quality improvement issues. You would probably want at least one or two program managers on that committee who could speak to the way the programs operate at the management level. They would certainly have sort of the big picture of how programs are operating and be able to represent the perspectives of mid-level managers. I'd also suggest that you have a ROMA trainer or implementer on your Quality Improvement Committee, or possibly if you, again, are a smaller agency, your ROMA trainer or implementer might also serve in that role as your Quality Improvement staff person to manage the process. But of course, as we've been stressing, ROMA principles and practices are crucially important and are embodied by your customer satisfaction system. So I think it would make sense to have somebody with that ROMA background serving in that capacity. You may also want to have a human resources representative. One of the things that we talked about last week was the importance of making sure that you're supporting your staff through things like training and incentives. And so your HR staff person is a critical connection to the overall HR function, and making sure that staff are being supported in terms of your internal capacity building efforts, that you're addressing any issues that come up in terms of that staff-customer interface, and that you're looking for opportunities to recognize and reward staff for providing high levels of customer service and making sure that that is integrated into the agency's overall approach to human resources. And so I think that is the HR staff person is an important liaison between your quality improvement committee and the overall HR function in the agency. And finally, you may want to have a leadership team representative on this committee, again, to provide that important connection to upper level management to represent the interest of your overall leadership team, and also to make sure that any updates, any key issues are dealt with in a more rapid fashion rather than waiting maybe for a quarterly update. So again, I think it's helpful, especially if you're a medium-sized or a larger agency, to have a number of different representatives on your quality improvement committee to make sure that you're able to pull in the experience, perspective, and resources from the different functional units like your HR function, your frontline staff, and your managers to make sure that you really have a 360-degree process in place that's including perspectives from all levels of the agency. So next, to turn to what your quality improvement committee would actually be doing on a regular basis. As I said, ideally you would be meeting on a monthly basis to review that customer satisfaction feedback data. Again, if you're maybe a smaller agency or that's just simply not possible, I would suggest that you would meet on a quarterly basis, although no less frequently than that, because you want to be able to identify and address any issues that are identified in the data. Another thing your committee or staff person would be responsible for doing is soliciting feedback from frontline staff and managers on overall quality improvement. And so I think this is an important point to stress. While your customer satisfaction data is a critical part of overall quality improvement efforts, there's certainly lots of other things that I think an innovative agency can be doing and looking at to improve the overall quality of its programs. And so making sure that you're routinely soliciting feedback on ways to improve your programs from frontline staff and managers in addition to your customers, I think is just simply good practice. Another responsibility of the team would be the committee would be to coordinate with human resources and others, like your Roma trainers, on training and capacity building. So you may identify particular trainings that would help build staff capacity and address any issues that came up, and make sure that you're supporting your staff so they can provide the highest level of customer service possible. Another important role of the committee or individual staff person is to make recommendations to the leadership team. So what you're doing is looking at and synthesizing the data that comes back from your customer surveys, like we talked about at the very beginning, turning that data into information by analyzing it, and then summarizing key points, key trends, and making recommendations to the leadership team on any particular issues that they need to act on. And so the committee becomes a key intermediary between the program level and the leadership team. And then finally, the committee would be responsible for managing overall quality improvement policies and programs. And I really need to stress the importance of this for agencies to have a policy on how they collect and analyze customer satisfaction data. I know sometimes it can be challenging given all the other data collection requirements that we have in community action. I think that's a crucially important part to make sure that that you have a true system in place rather than simple ad hoc activities when it comes to collecting your customer satisfaction data. Having a clear policy on how often data is collected, who that data is sent to, how that then gets reported up to the management team and ultimately the board. Is important just to make sure that you stay on track and on schedule, and that staff at all levels know what expectations are for data collection and for your overall approach as an agency to your quality improvement efforts. So just to give you a sense of what the sample reporting process might look like, as I've said previously, perhaps a monthly discussion of quality improvement practices at the program and service level is helpful. So each program would be looking at their customer satisfaction data, any other quality improvement issues that staff identify, and having a regular discussion about what they can do to improve service. And as we discussed last week, this is really important to build an overall culture of quality improvement and excellence across the agency from top to bottom. Having those monthly discussions or perhaps quarterly discussions, again, if it's a little bit too difficult to do those on a monthly basis, is important to make sure there are opportunities for staff feedback. Your frontline staff and your managers are probably best positioned to identify what's working and where there might be those opportunities for improvement in your programs, and manage that at the program level. Then the next phase of reporting would be monthly or quarterly reports of that data from those initial interactions between staff and customers that get reported to your quality improvement committee or your quality improvement staff person. And as I've said, it's important to make sure that you're looking at that data above the program level, right, across your agency as a whole, so somebody is responsible for looking at that big picture. Then you would have quarterly reports on that data after service delivery is completed across all programs and services and all program and service staff. So you're looking at that, a sort of quarterly roll-up of that data. And then you might have biannual reports on overall service outcomes to the Quality Improvement Committee and program or service staff. And so as we discussed last week, you're looking to collect data at 3 different points. Most routinely, data about that initial interaction when a customer comes in to access services. You then want to collect at the second point data on customer satisfaction after they've received the services. And then finally, the third point would be after they've achieved the outcome that the service or program was intended to produce. So you're looking at that initial interaction data on a more regular basis because, of course, you have ongoing daily interactions between staff and customers. A little bit less frequently, as I said, maybe on a quarterly basis, you're reviewing that data on how customers rate your programs after they've received the service, and then maybe a little bit less frequently on that biannual or annual level on the overall outcomes that your customers are able to achieve. And then lastly, I strongly suggest that you have a scorecard that's used to capture all the data. We'll talk a little bit about what might be included in the scorecard a little bit later, but I think it's helpful to have a document that rolls up your customer satisfaction numbers, allows both the Quality Improvement Committee and management staff and the board to be able to look at your results over time. So you would want to include how you've done over the last couple months or ideally over the last year, so you can identify trends in data that you're collecting, and make sure that you have that ongoing record of how you're doing in terms of your overall customer satisfaction. So again, it's just important to have that process and structure in place, clear policies and procedures that describe how often data is collected, where it goes, what process is used for analyzing that data, to make sure that you have a fully deployed, fully integrated customer satisfaction and quality improvement system. So I'm going to stop for just a second, see if any questions have come in through the chat window. Was anything?
Tiffany Keating just wanted to clarify the exact the regulation around how often you have to do the customer satisfaction data. Is it every 3 years just to include for the community needs assessment?
Sure. So the question from the audience is, how often do you have to collect customer satisfaction data? As we talked about last week, there is another standard that says you have to use your customer satisfaction data as part of your, that's collected as part of your needs assessment process in your overall strategic planning process. But the standard about customer satisfaction talks about making sure that you have a system in place that collects, analyzes, and reports on your customer satisfaction data. So in theory, your system could be to collect and report that customer satisfaction data every 3 years. I think that might be sort of pushing the letter of the law in terms of the standard a little bit. As always, you should check with your state office about how they interpret the standards, especially the one around customer satisfaction, because it does have a few more moving parts. So when I talk about collecting and analyzing your customer satisfaction on a monthly or a quarterly basis, this is just me providing what I think is a best practice in this case. Again, your agency may not have the staff capacity to collect and analyze data that regularly. The standard simply says that you have a system in place that collects, analyzes, and reports your customer satisfaction data. So if that happens less frequently, as long as you're doing that in a systematic way, as long as you're analyzing or collecting, analyzing, and reporting your data, I would think that you would be in compliance with the organizational standards. But again, check with your state office to see specifically how they are defining that particular standard, because again, the standard itself does not say how often you collect the customer satisfaction data, only that you collect that data. All right, so moving on to your to the surveys. So what do you need for having a good system in place to make sure you're surveying your customers to collect that customer satisfaction data? So some things to think about. First of all, it would be ideal to have staff who has a background in survey design, in terms of data collection and analysis skills, so to help with designing your customer satisfaction survey, also to serve on your quality improvement committee. So an important step is to look at your internal capacities and identify the staff person who would be ideally suited to play that particular role, because survey design is a more technical process, as we'll talk about in just a few slides. There are right ways and wrong ways to go about designing surveys, so ideally you would have a staff person who has at least a minimum amount of background in putting surveys together. Another factor you need to look at is time. So as I mentioned, there may be capacity issues in your agency. If you're a smaller agency, it may be challenging to collect customer satisfaction data, maybe more than on a quarterly basis or even a biannual basis. So as you're designing your system, one thing to consider is what is reasonable in terms of the overall frequency of collecting that customer satisfaction data. Technological support is another factor to consider. I strongly suggest using a program like SurveyMonkey to do your data collection, and as I've said, aggregating that data that you collect into a scorecard. And so make sure that you're comfortable working with sort of the basic computer infrastructure in terms of collecting that data. Of course, it's perfectly okay if your agency still uses a paper system. I know a lot of agencies pass out simple flyers to their customers to provide that data, do mail-out surveys for their customers, and that's perfectly okay if you want to, although we will discuss some alternatives to that particular approach. But think about what kind of technical support you would need in terms of the logistics of managing the information that you're collecting. As I also said, you want to look at that overall reporting schedule. So as you put together your customer satisfaction or quality improvement committee or assign a staff person, you're thinking about that reporting schedule that we just discussed. Another thing to think about is community support. You might be able to identify a couple of volunteers who have a background in customer surveys or doing customer satisfaction training. There may be another agency that does it particularly well. You may be able to leverage support from someone like a local chamber of commerce. So look to the community resources that you can identify, especially if you're a smaller agency and don't have a lot of internal capacity to collect and analyze your customer satisfaction data. And then finally, you might look at additional sources of funding just to get your system up and running, or to provide some additional support for things like trainings, maybe to bring in someone to do a little additional customer service training, cultural competency, or other issues that you might identify as being important to support your staff around. So, methods of measuring customer satisfaction. What you see up on the screen are a number of different ways to collect feedback from your customers. As I said, one of the most common ways we see at the agency level is collection through a survey, so often a paper survey that some customer would pick up maybe on their way out of the office. I know some agencies do mail-out surveys. And of course, we increasingly hear about agencies that are using online surveys, which I personally think is probably one of the better methods for collecting that data for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. But of course, comment cards are usually your frontline method for collecting that information. Other agencies have 1-800 numbers that allow customers to call in. This is another way, especially if there are any issues that arise that a customer may want to talk about to someone directly, like an ombudsperson, to resolve any issues that they might have. And so that 1-800 number makes sure that there's a way that your agency can be responsive to any issues that have arisen that a customer would like to resolve with how a service is provided. But of course, that's also an important way to collect that customer satisfaction information. Complaint monitoring and resolution is another way to collect that information. Some agencies, as I mentioned, have an ombudsperson or someone in a similar role who works with any disputes that customers have about services that have been provided to them. And of course, that is an important source of information when you're looking at your overall customer satisfaction results and system. Focus groups are another important method that you can use to collect that data. So survey data only tells you so much. It's helpful for getting sort of the big picture across a large number of people, but it doesn't always let you get down to the story underneath the numbers. And so convening a focus group of your customers, maybe on a quarterly or a biannual basis, to talk a little bit about your customer service results, about how your overall programs and services are doing, is just another way to get some additional information that lets you get at some of the stories underneath those numbers and figure out what's behind some of the higher scores that you get, and also maybe some of the lower scores to identify exactly what those issues are. Community meetings, which many agencies convene, I think, on maybe an annual basis, maybe as part of your community needs assessment, is another way to collect that information. So passing out comment cards at your community meetings, or even setting aside part of the agenda to talk about how you're serving the community, is another way to collect that data. As we've already discussed, you can have a quality improvement committee that collects data not just from your external customers, but also looks at your frontline staff, your managers, and is tasked with collecting data from your staff, your internal customers, about how things are going. And of course, at the end, I also included testers and secret shoppers. I'm not necessarily a big fan of this approach because it can create issues around trust and confidentiality. Staff feel feel like they're being surreptitiously observed. But as we discussed last week, some effective ways of gathering information about your customer service is to do something like a walkthrough exercise where someone goes through and plays the role of a customer and sees what it's like to receive a service from your agency. So, I would suggest generally doing that as a process that people are aware of. But I think having folks go through that, the process of actually accessing a service can often provide some valuable information about how you're doing overall as an agency. So next, let's talk about the surveys that you use, and typically, what we see is comment cards that are provided to our customers at that initial time when somebody walks in and has that initial conversation, goes through the intake process, or otherwise has that first interaction with your agency. So what you see up on the screen is just a handy survey question checklist that gives you some tips, some do's and don'ts for how to design your survey. I won't go through all of the specific points, but as I said, it's helpful to have somebody with a background in survey design read through your survey. We'll talk about some of the questions that you can ask in a second that have sample wording. But in general, make sure your surveys are simple and direct. You're usually just collecting data through 4 or 5 questions. You might get away with 6 or 7, but again, you really don't have much time and space to collect that initial data, and that makes it even more important that your survey is designed effectively to get exactly the information that you need as an agency. So I would just suggest that as you do your survey design for your customer satisfaction system, make sure you've got a staff person with that background. Maybe do a little bit of reading about good survey design. In addition to this checklist, there is that resource that I talked about at the beginning that goes through how to design a good survey. So availing yourself to those types of resources to make sure that you've given some additional thought to how you're putting that survey together is important. So up on the screen, just some words of wisdom from the American Statistical Association that underscores the importance of good survey design. But for me, really, the bottom line is a well-designed survey is more likely to be filled out by the customer, therefore getting you better data, better information about how you're doing with your programs and services, and ultimately improving how you're delivering those services to the customer. And I think that is crucially important, not only for good outcomes, but making sure that our customers access our programs and services. I think we talked about this last week, but one of the reasons why customer service is important is because it's one of the factors that determine whether our customers will continue to access our services, refer our agency to their friends, families, and other people in the community. So I think it starts with a well-designed survey and way to gather that initial information you're getting from the people that you serve. So what you see on the screen right now are some examples of basic customer satisfaction questions for that initial intake. So again, these would be questions that you would have on a comment card or ideally on an online survey. We'll talk a little bit in a second about how you can set a system like that up. But as you see, these are very simple, very direct questions. And another thing I think that these questions underscore is the importance of making sure that you're collecting actionable information. So for example, the first question, when I entered the building, I felt welcomed. If you were receiving lower scores on that particular question, you would know pretty much immediately exactly what the issue was. It would be something around that initial interaction, that greeting, and it would allow you to dig a little bit deeper and identify sort of where the issues were that were behind those scores. Another example, that next question, the facilities are clean. If you're getting lower scores on that, you know exactly what the issue is. And so I think these are just good sample questions that show, I think, how you're using simple, direct language that's getting at exactly what kind of issue may be responsible for high levels of customer satisfaction or maybe challenges that you're experiencing in terms of that initial interaction. So as I said, in survey design, especially for customers who have just come in to maybe begin the process of intake, having that initial interaction, you really don't have a lot of time. Just think about how many questions that you would be willing to answer on that survey. So make sure that these are relatively short, concise surveys. I usually suggest 4 or 5 questions. Like I said, you might be able to get away with a few more. And another tip, if you do want to ask more questions, is simply to have 2 surveys, 2 versions of the survey that ask different questions, which allows you to collect a little bit wider range of intake. So the first customer might get survey A, the second survey would get customer B, and they would just alternate back and forth, which lets you ask a broader range of questions, but still limit the overall number of questions, so you're more likely to get responses. What you see up on the screen is just a sample of a classic paper-based system. This particular survey was taken from one of our agencies, and just shows you what a customer satisfaction card would look like. This would typically be available in the waiting area, or a staff person might hand the customer this particular card and ask them to just take a little bit of time, fill it out, and put it in a comment box as they exit the facility. So we're really not talking about, I think at a basic level, anything more complex than this comment card, although I do advocate for online systems. I think they're a little bit easier to use. It's a little bit easier to aggregate the data. But if this is a system you have, I think sort of this is the minimum that you would need to collect good data. So before I go on, I want to see if there are any questions that have come in.
About posting this, that's good.
Okay. So again, please feel more than free to put your comments and questions in the chat box as we go through the discussion.
Actually, another one as well. When you're talking about the various types of systems to collect data, we have a question from Allison West about if you know of anyone who's using automated text messages as a way to collect surveys.
Sure. So the question is, do we know of anyone who's using automated text messages to collect surveys? I'm not aware of anyone who's doing that, but I'll give you a couple of examples in a second about how agencies are using online systems, but I think that's a really good potential method to look into. One of the examples we've seen, I know of an agency in Texas who has an app on a cell phone that either a staff person can access or one of their customers can access. So I think agencies are increasingly turning to internet-based, especially cell phone or tablet systems to collect that customer satisfaction data. And we're finding actually more and more customers have cell phones, and so that text, I think, would be another method to use. So I can look into that as we continue to gather resources for our network. All right, so a couple tips around the feedback instrument and system design. So when you're looking at that initial survey that you're providing your customers, as I said, make sure you're asking questions that provide actionable feedback. So, a good rule of thumb is to simply ask yourself, if we were getting low scores on a particular question, would we know exactly the issue that the customers were having with our service? So when you ask a more general question, if you just say, I was satisfied with the level of customer service I received, that might seem to be an important question to ask, but because it's phrased in a very general way, if you're getting lower scores or getting higher scores, it's hard to see what's behind them. And so that's why I really suggest that you ask those focused questions that let you know exactly what's going on. Is it because the facilities weren't clean? Is it because they weren't open at convenient hours? Was there an issue with the interaction with staff? Those basic issues, sort of those types of questions let you drill down and know a little bit quicker exactly what's going on. Another suggestion is to use the Likert scale over yes-no option. So just going back quickly to the comment card that I put up on the screen, you can see that it simply uses yes-no options, and while that may seem to be a little bit simpler, I think for me, using that Likert scale, meaning a rating system from 1 to 5, so strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that structure for asking questions. Provides you with a little bit more range. You can see sort of the level of sort of input that your customer is getting. It gives them a little bit more range to provide their feedback, and sort of you can see how strongly they feel about the responses that they're getting. Yes, no is just, it's a binary category. You only have 2 choices, and so it really doesn't give you quite as much information as if you use a scale with 5 different levels. Next, I do think it's certainly helpful to ask open-ended questions, but my suggestion here, instead of saying something like just simply provide us any additional feedback you have about how we can improve our services, phrase it asking for a very specific thing. So, for example, what's the one thing we can do to improve our service? So I think it's been shown that it's much more likely for folks to provide that open-ended feedback, and that's where you get a lot of useful information. So when you do have an open-ended question, make sure you're asking very specifically, encouraging the person to provide you, just 1 or 2 pieces of feedback instead of asking, a truly open-ended question without that kind of direction. And then lastly, try to link different methods to provide in-depth feedback. So for example, following up, collecting your data through those comment cards or an online system, with a quarterly focus group where you bring your customers together. So as I said, that provides you with a little bit more in-depth information. You can dig underneath the answers that you're getting and really take a little bit of extra time to talk to your customers about what's going on. And so I think, comment cards and surveys are a great way to get that initial information, but just try linking them with another qualitative method that lets you get at a little bit more depth of information, on that quarterly or biannual basis. So now let's talk about some tips for making sure you're increasing your response rate, because that's one of the most common issues that agencies have. I was just talking to an agency at a training that I was doing that said they mail out their customer satisfaction surveys and they only get a handful back. And so let's look at some ways to make sure you're improving your response rate. So I was able to find one study done by the Urban Institute in 2013 that reported that nonprofits that were focused on making sure they had good customer satisfaction systems in place were able to get response rates between 40 to 60%, which is much higher than the response rate for a cold survey, one that you're just mailing out. You're probably not going to get that many people responding to you. And one of the things that characterized these organizations that were able to get higher response rates was that they really made sure that they made it as convenient and easy as possible for the customer to provide that feedback. So let's talk about some of the ways that they were able to do that. So as I've been saying, especially for your initial surveys, the ones that someone would take, a customer would take after they've had that initial interaction with your agency through an intake or a referral, try to limit those questions, no more than 5 or 6, like I said, maybe 7 or 8 if you want to push it a little bit. But if you ask many more questions than that, people are just simply not going to take the time to respond. So making sure that you're focusing and targeting those questions, I think, is one way to get those response rates up. Another approach is making sure that you're using those multiple methods. Ideally, you would have a couple of different ways. So, not everyone is comfortable providing feedback online through their cell phone or through a tablet, even if it's something that a staff person just simply hands them. So having those comment cards is another way to collect that information. I think mail-out surveys, again, I'm not a big fan of those simply because I'm just not really sure sure they're worth your overall investment of time, because you do tend to get a fairly low response rate. If you're not getting the response from the customer while they're actually on site after they've had that interaction, your chances go down significantly of getting feedback from them. So really making sure you're focused on getting that information when they're there in your facility, interacting with your staff, I think is crucially important. Another thing that's critical is preserving customer anonymity. People are much less likely to provide feedback if they think it will have some negative effect on them, or if it'll be traced back to them. So again, making sure that the way that survey is provided to the customer preserves their anonymity, that staff emphasize, for example, if you have an online survey, that it is anonymous, that they have no way of, that they don't collect any identifying information, and of course for things like comment cards, making sure that you don't ask the customer for their name on it, and that it goes into something like a secure box, so it's clear that their comment is anonymous. Again, another important principle is taking the survey to the customers and looking at ways to get that information that emphasize ease, convenience, and incentives. So, for example, having a staff person with a tablet that has the survey already up, handing that to the customer when they're finished, and just asking them to answer a few questions to improve the overall service that the agency provides. That's the easiest thing for the customer. It's right there. You can get immediate feedback. And so for me, that's the ideal system. There's one agency in Texas that has QR codes, those things that you can scan in with your phone on the desk of folks who interact with customers in the intake or the case management process, and they've been trained to say at the end of their interaction with a customer, we're all done now, which is their cue to then either scan in that QR code into a tablet or a cell phone and offer it to the customer, or the customer can use their cell phone to scan that code in themselves, and it takes them to a web page that's www.we'realldonenow.com, which is the agency's customer satisfaction survey, and the customer can provide the feedback right there. And so I think that's maybe similar to using a text message to request feedback. I think that's a great idea. So like I said, we can look into agencies that might be using that particular option. But again, the easier you can make it on your customer, the greater the chance you'll get that feedback directly from them. And then finally, make sure that you're integrating those surveys into the intake process. Offering staff training, making sure staff know that it's important to collect the information, and as I said with that previous example, that's part of the intake process in that Texas agency. Staff are trained to complete their interaction with their customer and encourage them to take that online survey. And so just leaving it up to the customer to provide that feedback, I think, results in lower response rates. So the more convenient you make it for your customer, the more your staff are encouraged to proactively reach out to customers and ask them to provide you with that data. I think the higher the response rate that you're going to get. So this slide has a number of diagnostic questions for developing a customer satisfaction survey. So this is something that you can use back in your agency, especially if you're just getting your customer satisfaction system up and running, or you're looking at expanding your particular system. And I think these are helpful questions for your quality improvement committee or your quality improvement officer, your staff person to run through. So again, just some helpful diagnostic questions that'll help you think about where you are with your current system, and also help you think through some of the logistics if you're looking to create or expand your system to collect more data. So asking questions about, when customers receive that initial survey, I think is important. For example, you may have programs and services like a VITA tax preparation service where your customer only has one interaction. They go to the VITA site, your staff helps them fill out their tax return, and that's it. And so in that particular case, you would want a survey of customer satisfaction as soon as they complete that particular, as soon as they receive that particular service. At your physical sites where customers are coming in, maybe they've been referred to your agency or they're going through the intake process, that would be probably a different collection procedure because you're interacting with staff in a different way. So thinking through those basic logistical issues, you might have to collect data in slightly different ways for different types of programs and services. I'd also encourage you to think about what your target response rate is, see what you think those numbers can get, and I think that just helps to provide a good target and hopefully encourages staff to continue to solicit that information, that feedback from your customers. As we've talked about previously, looking at if there's any additional staff training that's required, I think it's important, making sure staff feel supported and that they're aware of what the policies and procedures are for collecting that information is important. We've already talked about what form that you might collect that information, making sure that you ideally have some multiple ways to collect information from your customers, I think is important. Reviewing any issues around confidentiality and accessibility of information. We've already talked about that. How you manage things like complaint resolutions is just an important discussion to have if you haven't already addressed some of those issues. And then asking about when you conduct follow-up. So we've mostly been talking about collecting customer satisfaction data at that initial point of interaction, but as I said, you also want to collect that data after the customer has received those services. And those are probably going to be somewhat different questions, more tailored to your individual program or service. But I think that's important to talk about, making sure that at least ideally you're collecting data at a couple different points, at that initial interaction and after the customer has received the service. And then of course, as we've discussed, talking through your structure and process for collecting and analyzing that information. So what you see up on the screen now are just some additional sample topics and questions for designing your surveys after your customers have received the service. And so as you'll see, some of these have questions that are similar to the ones you ask at that initial interaction, but of course you may want to design some program-specific questions because you're asking your customer how they felt about that particular service after they've gotten the weatherization crew out to their house to do their work, after the parent of a Head Start kid has received the service, over 6 months or a year after the school year is over. So those that process, probably the frequency of collection is going to vary, the questions are going to vary a little bit more. So these are just some examples of different questions that you might ask at that particular point in time. So again, you can access these slides to look at these questions in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go through each one, but these are also taken from that Urban Institute document that I showed at the very beginning, so you can reference that for additional detail on the types of questions that you would want to be asking at different points in the process. And so let's conclude with basic data analysis questions. So once you've collected your data, again, you're asking some fairly simple, fairly straightforward questions. You're looking, obviously, most importantly, at overall trends in the data. Are your customer satisfaction scores going up? Are they staying the same? What is the overall trend with the agency? And that may point to a need for additional staff training. It may point to the need for, maybe doing some repair and refurbishment on your facilities. Whatever the issue is that's identified in the data that you're collecting. But again, looking at that data over time, I think is the most important thing to identify those trends and then hopefully get at what's underneath that trend. You may also look at differences from different segments of your customer population, customers that are receiving different types of services or services at different locations. Your responses may vary, especially if you're an agency that delivers services in multiple counties or in different buildings. You would want to make sure that you're looking at your scores not just in aggregate, but at those different physical places places because, you know, staff in one particular area or one particular program may need some additional support, or there may be other issues that you would have to address. And then, of course, looking at the feedback from the customers and staff themselves about opportunities for improvement. So making sure that you're collecting that data, that's one of the best sources of identifying ways to improve your customer satisfaction and seeing what the staff or your customers are saying in terms of concrete ways to improve service. So last slide, looking at what to include on customer satisfaction scorecards. As I said, having a basic instrument that rolls up the data that you're collecting, I think is important. Having, you know, at least the last 3 months of data. It helps you see those trends. It helps you analyze the data. And of course, dividing that data, again, into different programs and services so you can see different scores across your programs and services. If you're collecting that customer satisfaction data at different facilities, you would want to organize the data by those facilities so you could see any differences because, again, there may be different issues in different places that you would need to address. So making sure you're looking not only at that data in aggregate, that you're looking at it at the program level, at the facility level, I think is important in terms of tracking your overall results. And of course, lastly, making sure you're looking at a summary of themes from the open-ended comments that you're getting from customers and staff alike. So that concludes our webinar for this afternoon. We have a continuing Organizational Standards Center of Excellence webinar series. Our next 2 webinars are scheduled for Monday, March 12th at 2 o'clock and Wednesday, March 15th at 2 o'clock. And these focus on leadership development and succession planning. So the first webinar is going to focus on developing your leadership bench, making sure you've got good training plans in place, looking at longer-term staff development, and the second webinar will focus on creating your leadership succession plan, of course for your executive director, but also for other senior management positions in your agency. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for those webinars. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, and the slides and recording of this webinar will be available on the partnership website in a couple of days. So thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Hope to see you on future webinars, and again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to serve our agencies, and don't hesitate to let us know if there's anything we can do to support your work. Thank you very much.